Welcome to the final video in the series. We're continuing talking about arrays. In this video we're going to talk about arrays and functions. The first thing we want to say is that if one element of the array is passed as an argument to a function, then there's nothing special because the element of the array itself has a base data type, such as int or float. So when you pass the array, the argument that you pass has to identify which variable that you're talking about. So you got to give the array name and a subscript to pass it. The receiving function has no knowledge of where that single value came from. So it does not need to be aware that there's an array from which the argument came. So here's a simple example of a function that will display a single integer value. When I call the function, I can pass it any of the values from inside the array. Now, in other instances, you want the whole array to be passed as a function. So there's two parts to this. One part is how do you make the call? And here we see that when I want to pass the whole array, what I need to supply is the name of the array. Be really careful now. When I pass the array, all I need to say is the name of the array. Please do not try to put square braces when you pass the array. On the other hand, if I am writing the header for a function that receives an array parameter, I must put the square braces to indicate that what is being passed is not variable t, which is a single value, but an array, a one-dimensional array of values. Okay? Now, you need to note that if I pass a whole array, that whole array is passed by reference, which simply means that the function that receives the array has the ability to change any value in the array. All right? So you must be careful in writing the body of a function that's passed an array not to mistakenly change values that you should not be changed. Now, so how do you pass an entire one-dimensional array? As I said earlier, pass the array name without brackets. Now, often you need to also pass, along with the array, a variable that says how many elements are currently being used. We have called that so far the size of the array. So most functions that deal with arrays, you don't just pass the array by itself, you pass additional information. So the function prototype would say I need an integer array and I also need another integer. The header gives more information. It says I want an integer array, the parameter name is going to be a, and I also need an integer parameter which will just be a variable. And the association is that the name of the array is a, the parameter is a, and the parameter for the size is called a size. It's kind of good to keep those variable names similar like that. To make the function call, I must pass it the name of the array followed by the current size. That can be a number or it could be a variable. Right. Now, let's go back and illustrate some of this. Let's go in here and let's go ahead and write a function that will show you the entire contents of an array. So what did we learn before about such a function? If I want to show each value in the array, I need a for loop. In fact, I need this loop here. So that's going to be the function. And how do I call it? Notice that I have an array which I have initialized. The size of the array is 5. So now I can just call the function show. Let's do it your way. We're going to say T sub boom. We're going to try that in 5. Let's compile that and see what happens. So if I try to compile, I will get, please give me an error. It'll say parse error in line 12 before the token. Okay? And whether you know it or not, it's kind of telling you if you're going to put an open brace, you got to put a number in there. So let's put a number in there. So let's compile that and see. And what is it going to say? Wow. It's going to say invalid conversion on line 12 from int to int star. The little star here, we're going to find out later. The star really means an array. That's another way of saying it's an array. So let's get back in and see what we're saying. Let's talk about what we're passing. What is this? T, if T is an array, then T sub 3, is that an array? According to the function here, the first argument needs to be a whole array. Is T sub 3 a whole array? No, it's a value. It's a single value, not an array. So we can't say that. So is it kind of clear? You can never put if I'm passing the whole array, I can never put braces. So I must pass the whole function, the whole array instead. When we do that, what do we have? And when we run it, we get the values out of the array. Okay? Now, we've done this about 5 times. Now we've said all this. Where am I? Now what about a two-dimensional array? I need to say one thing. Notice one thing. One thing is very critical. I can illustrate it right here. Notice that when I write a function that receives an array, I do not try to redeclare the array entirely. Notice that in this line, all I'm really conveying is that I have an array that takes one subscript. We call that a one-dimensional array. I am not trying to say how large that array is, the capacity or the size of it. So what happens when I have a two-dimensional array? Suppose I had the array we saw earlier with exams. If I want to pass, let's talk about the function header. Let's look at this header. Notice that, said another way. Let's look at the prototype. Let's look at the prototype. Notice that what we're saying is I'm going to be passed an integer. The moment I see left brace, it says array, but I see subscript. So I see 2 of these, which means that whatever I pass will use 2 subscripts. That means it's a two-dimensional array. So let's take a look in more detail. Notice that the array that we were using is an array that has 2 columns. It's important to note if there's a two-dimensional array, you do not say how many rows. So this is open, the number of rows, but the number of columns, you must say how many columns there are in the array. So whatever's being passed is an array with so many rows but only 2 columns. And when I make the call, I must pass the number of rows. All right. If the array has more than 2 dimensions, it has rows and columns and depth or whatever, then when you declare it with 3, when I call it, I must leave the first dimension blank here, but I must supply the same values here that we use to declare it. All right? Now, it is possible that writing all of this stuff is very time consuming. There's one feature of C++ where we can give a name to a data type, and that's called the typedef statement. The format is typedef followed by some existing type followed by a new name. And we basically are creating an alias or a different name for a data type. The typedef does not create a type. It just renames the type. So if I say typedef, we're saying that the data type money has the properties of the data type float. So money is just another word for float. Sometimes the typedef can make your program more readable, and it can give a name to an array-based type. For example, if I have this declaration, if you look at it, it looks like we're creating an integer array of 12 elements. And we're giving the type name year array. So once I have this data type established, it really means int 12. So I can declare two arrays, high temps, low temps, and they each are integer arrays of capacity 12. When you declare an array, the capacity really is part of the type. Alright. You can also use typedef for a parameter. So instead of saying, so let's go back. So right here. Come on, sorry about that. Instead of saying this, where we have to say int t open brace, open brackets, we can declare a data type that looks like this. And the name of the data type will be int array. Okay? And when in our function prototype, we can just say int array. We can just say int array as our data type. And notice that this data type is kind of incomplete because it has unspecified capacity. It doesn't say how much. If we go back up here, we see that this typedef does have a specified capacity. So on the one hand, typedef can make things appear simpler, but you must remember that when I see this header and it says int exams array, I've got to remember that this data type is an array, but I also probably have to remember how many dimensions the array is. One way to help yourself is to always, when you have a typedef that involves an array, put the word array in there. And that reminds you that you're dealing with an array. And with that, we're going to bring this to a close.